Hello, welcome. I'm Andre and I'm a classical pianist, and today I'm going to be talking about why it's so hard, at least for me, to listen to classical music. But before I get started, make sure that you like and subscribe so that you can continue to get more videos like this. So without further ado, let's go on to the video. So for the longest time, I've been wanting to make this video. However, because of the answer being a very complex thing, I had to boil it down to the main things as to why it's so hard for some of us to listen to classical music. And it's not because the music is, difficult to listen to, although I will get to that in a moment. It's because there's two things that I was able to find out. Point number one, some music is more slash easily digestible than others. Now, what I mean by this is that some pieces of music are easier to listen to. You can get them from the very first get-go, and it's not because they're not complex, but if you listen to music that's easy, and I'll give maybe two or three examples. For example, I'd say that the Turkish March from the Mozart Sonata is definitely one of those pieces that everybody hears and they're like, oh, yes, yes, I hear it, I love it, and they can listen to it and they don't really have to think so much about why, it's not as difficult to digest, is what I'm trying to get to. Another piece that I would say that people tend to listen to a lot, even though us pianists were tired of listening and teaching, is Für Elise. And the reason why is because it's simple enough that most people can digest it. I'm not saying that it's not beautiful, but I'm saying that it's simple enough that, your everyday person can listen to it and say, oh, yes, classical music, it sounds nice, right? And another example, which I guess comes from Beethoven, is his Moonlight Sonata. Mainly, I would say the first movement. The first movement tends to be more digestible, even though it's slower. It tends to touch people in ways that perhaps a more complex symphony might not. And it's not that, complex music is, unlistenable or anything like that, but it's simply easier to digest and there's not a whole lot going on around. Now, I've taught the sonata before. It's complex to teach just because you need to voice correctly and you need to make sure that the tempo is steady enough and that you have the right amount of rubato without you taking away too much time. So it has its complexities, at least from the performance side. But when you're in the audience hearing it, it's a little bit easier to take in the message. Like it's a little easier to hear the message than it is to necessarily play it. Now, another thing too is that some music, I would say, is a little harder to listen to. And it's mainly because it's either very dense or it's simply you have to listen to it more than one time. An example that I would give, even though it's a very beautiful piece and I'm pretty sure a lot of people get on the first try, would be the Schubert Sonata in B flat, I believe is number 21. That one, I remember hearing it for the first time and I was like, okay, I mean, it's Schubert. I mean, it's one of his better sonatas, but it was very long. It was very difficult to listen to. However, after listening to it a few more times, that's when I began to hear it and say, oh, that's beautiful. You know what I mean? There's some pieces you have to listen to various times, and little by little you start to understand the whole. But first you have to just sit down and listen to it because it's complex and our minds, we have to listen to different things. Some people who have perfect pitch, they hear the harmony and they're like, oh, it's going from a dominant to the tonic, and then he's doing whatever, and etc., etc. But for some of us, it's a little bit harder to listen to these pieces just because there's so much going on harmony wise, texture wise, and even from a technique standpoint, there's so many things that the pianist or any soloist could be doing that makes it difficult for us, the audience, to know what's happening. We have to voice certain things better. We have to quiet certain things better. Some people do half pedals, which makes things sound really good if you know how to do that. But that's the main point to this first point, that some things are more digestible than others. Not that it's bad, but it resonates with people faster. Now, my second point. Each composer is a universe in his own. Each one has his own way of writing, so you have to build up a history of listening. What I mean by this is that, as I said before, each composer is a universe in and of its own. If we take, for example, just Bach by himself, he wrote some pieces that were quite simple, and most people tend to love those pieces, like Air on a G string, or, the Ave Maria, which was later orchestrated, even though it's actually a prelude from, the prelude and fugues of the World Tempered Clavier Book 1. Anyways, the point is, the amount of works that Bach wrote was enormous. His catalog is, enormous. He wrote probably in the thousands of pieces. I mean, he probably wrote over 1,000 for sure. But each composer has his own, he has developed his technique of writing, his mannerisms in composing. He has developed them from the beginning all the way up, throughout all his life. And you can hear how there's a progression of how the pieces sound and such. For example, Franz Liszt, who's one of my favorite composers, he began writing, I wouldn't say boring pieces because they weren't. But if you, for example, take the etudes, his first set of etudes, which later, here we go, etudes opus 1. Hopefully you can see that. So his etudes opus 1, he wrote this right after he had just finished studying with Carl Czerny, I believe. And if you hear them, technically, yes, they're very difficult. However, when talking about the substance, I wouldn't say that they're as rich as his transcendental etudes, which I also have right here. The Liszt transcendental etudes. But these, I would say they're a little bit deeper. The amount of emotion that was poured into these was it's substantial. However, his technique, his way of writing, which has a lot of virtuosity in it, it's still there, and it's developed to the highest level you can possibly take it. So each composer, as I said, they encapsulate a whole universe. Now, an analogy that my friend made was that when you learn a piece, you should start with smaller pieces, and he called it a microcosmos. Now, a microcosmos is basically a cosmos, a universe, but it's smaller. Now, it's easier for you to learn pieces that are, smaller. Like, for example, if you're going to study a Chopin concerto, you should do maybe his nocturnes, his ballades, which I wouldn't consider the ballades a microcosmos, but I would say that they're a smaller work compared to the concertos. And you should do like the etudes, all of these pieces, which again, they're not, microcosmos, but the idea is you take in the smaller pieces so that then you get to a macrocosmos. And in a macrocosmos, you're seeing the big picture, macro, big. So you're getting the big picture, and that allows you to better perform the works because you've had experience with the writing, with the way that the composer writes. So that's what I think about point number 2. Each composer has microcosmos, macrocosmos, start with the micro, and then move on later to the macro. Now, I want to talk about the things that I have done to help me to listen to classical music a little bit more. It's not anything out of this world, but I do want to share with you guys because if it helps 1 or 2 people to listen to more classical music or to understand it better, then I've done my job. So the first point that I want to talk about is this: having a calm mind when listening can help see the larger picture, allowing you to digest harder music. Now, each of these points is going to offer a solution to the points that I mentioned above. What's helped me, at least many times, is that if you notice, our world, everything is moving 10,000 miles a minute. And so for us to be able to sit down, listen to something, it's not like it was before where you would go to the store, you'd buy a record or a CD, you'd sit down and you'd listen to the whole thing for an hour or 2 hours, depending on how big the CD was. So nowadays, because of streaming and all of these things like TikTok and YouTube, our distractions are bigger and we can't sit down and do things for a very long time. So one of the things that I've tried to do is that I will separate some time in my day, whether it's 10, 15, 20 minutes, to sit down and listen to a whole piece of music. Now, it helps if you have the score, but in the case that you don't, this is the mental exercise that I propose that you do. And I propose that if you sit down, think about the things that you need to do. Don't do this while you're playing the music, by the way. So sit down for a minute, just think about the things that you need to do, and then say, okay, I'm not going to worry about them for the next 20 minutes. You put it off to the side, and then you sit down, you press play on your iPad or whatever it is that you use to listen to music. You press play, and then hear the music. And try and clear your mind as much as possible. If you get a thought about something, just stop thinking about it. I mean, I guess, but try and avoid thinking about things while you're listening. Now, listen to the different, you can choose to focus on one or two things while you're listening. You could focus on the texture, you can focus on the melody, the harmony, stuff like that. Listen to that and see how that impacts you internally. By not having things in your mind, it allows for your ears to pick things up a little bit better, and you'll be able to better focus on the music. So, just to recap, sit down, clear your mind, listen to the music, and allow for you to hear the music in the little details. Now, for point number 2, start with a composer's greatest hits. This will make their work more familiar. Begin with piano works. So, the main reason why I say you should begin with a composer's greatest hits is because they're the greatest hits. Now, what I mean by this is that, like I said, each composer is a micro and a macrocosmos. Each piece is a micro, macro. But a composer he's written, a lot of music. A lot of composers wrote tons of music. For example, Bach, he wrote a lot of music. Mozart wrote a lot of music. He wrote like 20-some concerti. He wrote sonatas. Beethoven wrote 32 sonatas and 5 concertos. So listen to a lot of these pieces. Now, what I suggest is you should start with the greatest hits. So, for example, if you want to become more acquainted with Mozart, you should listen to the sonatas, but you should listen to the famous movements. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't listen to the whole, piece. For example, if you're going to listen to the Turkish March, listen also to the first movement, and I believe, which is themes and variations. It's so beautiful. I mean, if you think that classical music is beautiful, when you listen to this, you're gonna feel like you're in heaven. That's Mozart. Now, like I said, start with the greatest hits, and then start to listen to whole works. So, for example, if you're going to listen to the Tempest Sonata from Beethoven, I would say maybe start with the third movement, and then go back and listen to the first and the second movement. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't listen to the whole, but I would say that the third movement is a little more catchier than the first. But by starting to listen to the way that Beethoven writes, you'll become more accustomed to the textures and his harmonic language. And by doing this, once you listen to his more complex works like the symphonies, then it'll be easier for you to hear, and you'll know what he's doing. At least internally, you will know it. Maybe not from an intellectual point of view, but from a internal, more intuitive point, you will. Now, what I mean by start with the piano works is that with composers, a lot of composers, they write for the piano. They use the piano as a sketchpad. So the piano is a sketchbook to a lot of composers. If you listen to the Beethoven sonatas and then you try and listen to the concerti, you're going to be able to hear how Beethoven uses the orchestra, and it'll make a little more sense, because with the piano, you're limited to 10 fingers, 2 hands, and with an orchestra, you have over, 80 people. So the composer can do whatever he wants in terms of textures, in terms of harmony, and in terms of timbre, and all these other elements that make a work incredibly complex, like a symphony. If you can hear these things on something simple like the piano, once you start to hear the chamber or the orchestral works, it'll be easier for you to do that. So start with piano. It's good for you. If you made it this far into the video, thank you so much for staying. I really appreciate that you take the time out of your day to watch this video. I know that for some of us it's really difficult because we have a lot of things to do. It's always, impossible for us to watch everything that every content creator does. But I thank you so much for staying, and I hope that you learned something. If you did, go ahead and leave it down in the comments. Let me know if it helps you. If it doesn't, I don't know. It's helped me, so maybe it'll help you. In any case, I'll see you guys later. Ciao.